So let's talk a little bit about indexing and bell housing and why it's important. So behind me here is a CD09 trans, and I have an input shaft there as well. So let's turn this camera around and talk about why it's super important to make sure your bell housing is on center. So the way transmission works is it has dowel pins that are in the block, and then your transmission slides onto the block with some dowels. So this is a CD09, so it's not a T56, but the same principle applies. So basically those dowels make sure that this input is directly in center of the crank. If it's not in the center of the crank, what that can do is it can put load one way or the other in any direction on that, and it'll basically be pushing constantly on the input shaft. And what happens is on an input shaft, so this is an input shaft, this input shaft goes into the transmission. It rides here on the main shaft or on the counter shaft, and you have a bearing here, which is like a conical style, like a cone style bearing. And what happens is if this gets turned or tweaked, what it's going to do is it's going to move the pattern of where this gear rides to either the front or the back. And then it can also wear out this front input bearing really quickly. So you want to make sure that you index this bell housing because they can be off. Tremec calls for 5 thousandths. That's 0.005. That should be your max tolerance when you're measuring the bell. So, so basically take that index plate setup that I have and put it on there. Make sure you're within 5 thou, and that way you're going to have a reliable transmission. You're not going to have to worry about burning up a transmission or burning up parts in the transmission as long as you have that on center. So now that the transmission is removed, we have the back of the block here, the crank. Make sure that you're, while you have the clutch out or when you're doing this transmission swap, if that's what you're doing, or just doing a trans change, make sure the rear main seal is in good shape. Like this one looks like brand new, so we're not even going to bother replacing that. But just check that out, make sure it looks good. We're gonna go ahead and first step is gonna be to put the flywheel on here, and then we're gonna use it to help us index this bell housing. In order to index the bell housing to make sure it's on center with the crank, you're gonna need 4 major things here. We're gonna need a flywheel, we're gonna need flywheel bolts, the bell housing, and an index plate. And then in order to check the index, you're gonna need this tool, which is a magnetic base and a dial indicator. And you can get this at Harbor Freight. This whole setup here is about 40 bucks for everything. So these are the things you're gonna need. So first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna install the flywheel onto the crank with these flywheel bolts, and you're not gonna use any Loctite yet, all right? And I'm not gonna torque them down all the way. So we're gonna go like 65 foot-pounds on this, torque the flywheel on to the crank, and then we're gonna use the bell housing and the alignment plate to go around and check the index. So let's go ahead and install the flywheel, and then we'll come back to installing the bell. So here you can see the flywheel is installed. Now I did go ahead and torque this down to like 65 foot-pounds. I didn't go all the way up to 75. And I didn't use Loctite on them yet because if we end up getting to the point where our bell is out of spec, which I'm gonna make sure that we find a bell that is out of spec so we can show you how to fix it, these dowels have to come out to put in the offset dowels. So to do that, you can see here, there's not really much room to work with the flywheel in place. They kind of get in your way of being able to take those dowels out. So I didn't go ahead and do the final installation of the flywheel for now because the flywheel is probably gonna have to come back off for us to get these dowels out easily. So I'm gonna go ahead now, I'm gonna install the bell housing over top of the flywheel and get set up to start checking the index. Before we install the bell in here, what I want to do is go around and just make sure to clean off any debris that's around where the bell housing is going to mount to the face of the block, whether it be here in the lower oil pan. I noticed that there was some pretty decent rust here from where the factory bell was not really in contact. So I went ahead and took a razor blade and I went around here and scratched all this to make sure it was really nice and clean. I went around the cast iron block, and then I went around the bell, the aluminum part where the bell would attach as well. And then just make sure you clean around the dowels as well. Make sure all this around here is clean and free of debris. So you can see the bell is installed here now completely. And one of the tricks to get this a little bit easier for you to work on, so you can get to these upper bolts, is to use a exhaust jack under the front of the motor to lift it up so it tilts the motor back. So you're gonna install all the bolts in the bell to the block just to make it sure it's just like your final installation will be. You want when you test this index out, you want it to be exactly the same as it's gonna be during your final install. So if you got the kit from me, you're gonna use all 5 of the big M12 fine thread bolts, and then you're gonna use the 2 smaller M10 bolts in the bottom. So these 2 bolts in the bottom, and then all 5 of the bigger bolts around there, and torque them down to about 40 foot-pounds. And then we're gonna go ahead and do the index now. So I put the index plate on the bell, and one thing to be aware of is that the QuickTime bell in certain spots has shallower holes for the bolts. So you gotta be careful and make sure you use washers where you need to with these bolts so that you don't bottom the bolt out. You wanna make sure this is getting the plate down snug. So if you look back here on this side, you can see that one clears fine, but you can see there how that one is tapped out and it's pretty shallow. So just be careful, make sure you use washers where necessary. So now that the index plate is installed, we can install the magnetic base and the dial indicator in here and start moving around and seeing what we get as far as numbers. Now, with the magnetic base attached, and make sure it's good and sturdy, and you want to choose the, the surface back here, the flywheel, where it's going to stay and not move around. You don't want this moving around because you can see what happens when you move it, when you wiggle it. So, and you also want to make sure that nothing is contacting in here on your base stand. You want to make sure it can rotate freely without hitting anything. And then you're going to zero it out at the starting point, and then we're going to go around one time here and see where our numbers land. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and rotate around here one time and figure out where our lowest point is. We set to 0, so at the bottom we are at 0. There you can see -3, -5, -4. Now we're at 0. Now we're coming positive, +4, and back to 0. So it looks like, Rob, if you can go a little bit more, it looks like we're gonna be, our low point is about right there, which is 6th thou. Just hit it one more touch. Yep, 6th thou out right there. That's gonna be our low point. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna reset this to 0 again, because this is gonna be our low number. And I'm gonna put a mark on here. Maybe, if I can do this while I'm videotaping. So there's our 0 mark. Now we're gonna go around again, we're gonna find our high point. Okay, so there were 6, 7, 8, slow, 9, 10. Okay. Yeah, that's gonna be our high point right there. 10. Okay, keep going around. Yep, coming back down. And we're back to 0. Okay. So you can see here our line of out, or where we're gonna try to get our dowels in. So we're kind of facing this way from 0 down to 10. QuickTime makes 3 offset dowel sizes that are available for the 2J motor. So they are 0.007, so 7th thou, and then there's 14th thou, and then there's 21th thou. So the closest, you want to basically pick the closest number you are to your out number, which is 10 here. So you can see our straight line kind of going up this way, 0 up here, roughly. I mean, the 0 is kind of like all the way up through here, but the line's going this way. So we have 10th thou out. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a 7th thou out offset dowel in on each dowel location on the block. So now you can see the bell. I took the bell back off. I left the index plate on the bell just because we're going to be using it again. But I also, or Rob took out the dowels. So you can see the dowels are now removed out of here. Now, one of the tricks, like we were actually able to get these out with the flywheel installed. Now, you might not be able to do that because these can be really tight sometimes, but we used a set of vice grips like this, and Rob worked it back and forth while I pried on it with a pry bar behind the vice grips to kind of put tension on it while he turned it, and we were able to pop these right out. So this was one of the easier ones that we've ever had to take the dowels out. So that's just a trick you can try when trying to remove the dowels. So here we have the offset dowels down here on the bottom, the QuickTime ones, and we have the stock dowels that were removed. Now these ones are the RM145, which is the 7th thou offsets, and they make an RM146 and an RM147. You can order these right off my website. But one thing you'll notice is these dowels from QuickTime are a little bit longer than stock. So the problem is with them is if you don't cut them down on the backside, they're actually going to counteract all the offset because the non-offset portion is going to be sticking out past. So you want to make sure that this line here down the center is where the block ends, basically. So take off about 1.5 millimeters or 2 millimeters off of this side just to get them shorter so they fit better. And actually, if you order these off my site, I'll trim them down for you so they're right out of the box. So here you can see the ones that I cut down, and you can see them lined up there to see the shortness of them. And if you're looking for an overall length that these should be, if you're going to cut them down yourself, they're like 3/4 inches almost, right on the money as far as height goes to make them work. So I'm going to walk this over here and show you on the car why this is important. So here's our dowel hole, and here is our offset dowel, and you can see now that our dowel pin is able to go back in to the point where it has actually passed that half line where the offset is. So these offset dowels, you can see they have 2 flat marks on them. That's so you can turn them with a wrench when they're in the car to get them to be the angle you want them to be. But you can just barely see, this is 7 thou, so this is, like 4 sheets of paper probably, thickness wise, of the offset. And you can see that line where that offset is. It's kind of hard to see here. Try to turn my focus on. But on this side is where I have the higher side, and this side is my lower side. So basically we're going to put that in there and turn the flats. Sorry, it keeps going out of focus. Turn the flats so that they're in line with our offset line to try to get these where we want them. All right, so let's talk about which way to move these offset dowels to get the bell moving in the right direction. So if you remember in the last section, I had an angle going here from like 2 o'clock down towards 8 o'clock. It was the most out down here. So what we want to do is try to move the bell down towards that high number. So how do we do that? We do that with these offset dowels turned so they're pointing towards that direction. So basically the low side, if you can see it there, is going to be towards the 2 o'clock position, and the high side is going to be down towards the 8 o'clock position. So I have both dowels, the one over here and the one up here, pointing in that direction, so they're parallel. The flats on them are parallel with that 2 to 8 o'clock position line, and they're both going to pull the bell down here towards the lower left. So we're going to go ahead, reinstall the bell now on those dowels and see where the numbers shake out. All right, so after messing with the dowels a little bit, we got it right here, and we'll go around here and show you. So you can see we get up to like 3 thou. Now we're dropping back down. Now we're dropping back down towards 0. So there you can see we're at max 3 thou out, so that's good. We're within spec. After we're done here with the dial indicator, I'm going to take this off. I'm going to go ahead and take the bell off, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the dowels back out one at a time and Loctite the side that goes into the block with some red Loctite, just to make sure that they don't want to turn on me at all, so that they're permanent and in place. So now that we're done with the indication, you can go ahead and start into the clutch install.